Hi, everyone. I'm Abigail, and I'll be presenting my research from this summer on resourcing Michigan's coastal resilience managers. Oh, I don't think this is working. And the keypad too.
I might just need to click. Try it again. Oh, a second. Excuse me, we've got webcam issues. Okay. Oh, hold on. Apologies, we've got technical issues coming back from lunch. Okay, so I think we just need to click on here. Now it's working.
Okay. So a little bit about me. I'm originally from New York. I did my undergraduate degree at Florida International University, where I earned a degree in environmental studies and had specializations in biological conservation management and agroecology. Right now, I'm in my master's program at the University of Michigan Seas, where I'm studying environmental justice. And my big research interests are definitely climate change adaptation and mitigation, and freshwater and agricultural systems. So we had a couple of projects we worked on over the summer. The general problem statement that really is a good umbrella for everything that we were focusing on is that local resource managers often make reactionary decisions in response to coastal dynamics. And this is often due to a lack of capacity and funding and incomplete information and constraints. So our project was to determine the key informational needs of coastal managers and determine what gaps exist in filling those needs, and then supporting community-based resilience. So our first objective was to conduct an analysis of a workshop that took place to identify resource needs in those gaps. And our second objective was a compound flood hazard assessment and an evaluation of countermeasures, and that was in Berrien County, Michigan. So to frame this issue, I want to start with these graphs that depict lake levels from 1918 to 2024. And we can see that there's a natural fluctuation from highs to lows. And historically, this has resulted in what has been called a false sense of security, where as lake levels go out, people tend to move closer to the shoreline, and then inevitably those waters come back in. To illustrate this, I want to draw your attention to this section of the Lake Michigan Huron map. And what we can see here is that there was a dramatic swing from lake level lows to highs between 2014 and 2020. In 2020, lake levels reached historic lows, and only 6 years later, they were at historic highs. And this resulted in a great deal of flooding. In 2020 alone, Michigan's Department of Natural Resources and the Environment issued over 2,200 shoreline work permits, which are often used to mitigate flooding. And I also just wanted to point out that this pattern exists throughout the Great Lakes, but the Lake Michigan Huron is just the most dramatic example, so that's why I isolated that. So like I mentioned a moment ago, a predominant response to high lake levels is to adopt short-term solutions, such as installation of gray infrastructure and attempts to protect property. In this image, we can see that there is a metal seawall installed that has failed. So now this property is falling into the lake, and these homes are in danger of falling in as well. Often these types of solutions only work in the short term and also just disperse risk to neighboring properties and communities. And like I said, they just delay shoreline erosion and are not long-term solutions. So in recent years, there's been an influx of academic and scientific research on climate change adaptation. However, much of this has been focused on the Salt Coast and not here in the Great Lakes. So we wanted to understand where these deficiencies were coming from. So we found in our literature review that there is this short-term memory of communities along the coast. And what that means is that local support for adaptation and resiliency wanes and waxes based on the frequency of catastrophic events and time since the last event. There's also a misunderstanding or confusion around who's responsible for mitigating climate change impacts, a lack of capacity, information overwhelm, and that refers to this swing from coastal managers going from having not a lot of information to now so much of it that it's difficult to know what resources to rely on or trust and what to do. Funding is always an issue. We found that this is in two forms. One is access. It's often difficult to just access funding. And then the second issue is capacity, and that refers to the ability for communities to apply to and obtain funding, and also how to manage funding in large sums, especially for smaller communities. We also found there's a disconnect between scientific knowledge and adaptation policies and procedures. And finally, there's fragmented governance of coastal areas. A lot of these coastal areas are just governed through townships or just small communities, and there isn't a lot of conversation and collaboration between communities along the coast. So for our first objective, there was a workshop held in November of 23, and that hosted over 50 coastal managers and experts, where they participated in structured interdisciplinary discussions about coastal resilience and what is needed to adapt more resilient coastlines and support more resilient coastlines. And that data was analyzed to create a report of recommendations. So this summer, when I came on, I built upon that analysis and expanded it with just further analysis. We conducted a literature review and drafted a paper for submission. So we had a couple of main findings from that project. First was that coastal managers do make decisions under duress, often in response to some catastrophic event or impact, and not proactive decisions. And that we did confirm the short-term memory of coastal communities as a barrier to resilience. So those two things were supported in the literature. What we found that was novel is that there's a strong desire for collaboration and communities of practice among coastal managers through the Great Lakes region. There's a desire for more information and understanding about green or soft infrastructure options and how to permit those, and that there's a desire for expanded education on environmental science and policy. So all of this culminated with a paper that we've submitted. So we submitted that to the Journal of Great Lakes Research late last month, and it's under review right now. So our second objective was that compound flood hazard assessment, and that was in Berrien County, Michigan. What we're looking right now, that larger image in the top left corner, is a simulation of a storm event that happened in early 2021. And this was done by a PhD student with University of Michigan's School for Civil and Environmental Engineering, and is showing the water body, and then the flood extent is in that darker blue. And I've highlighted an image from a park in 2018 where there were these historic floods that's just completely submerged along the St. Joe River. So before we get into this project, I just wanted to provide some background on this region. Berrien County is known to have a lot of environmental justice concerns. This is the EJ Screen tool, which is an environmental justice assessment tool. And this is a demographic index. This is showing us areas that have high risk of environmental justice concerns, just overall using that demographic index tool. This is the same tool, but now we've highlighted flood risk. And what we can see is that Benton Harbor has both a high risk of environmental injustice and also flood impacts. So this is part of a collaborative project with the School for Civil and Environmental Engineering. It's a 4-year study. And what we did was help assess the risk of compound flooding, and we did that through interviews with stakeholders. So these interviews focused on flood risk, equity concerns, and paths forward. And what we wanted to do here was really engage the community and ensure that flood risk modeling and potential mitigation measure modeling was really reflective of what these communities need. So we analyzed those interviews using a tool called NVivo, and this is a qualitative analysis software. And what we can do is highlight parts of the text and assign it to a particular code that corresponds with the code book that I generated. So for example, this body of text talks about just general inequities and struggles that Benton Harbor faces. So I coded that equity concerns. This next chunk of text talks about the capacity, and then this addresses both of those. So this is just illustrating how that coding works and how we organized this qualitative data. So We're still in the analysis process now, but some preliminary findings are that there's a strong preference for green infrastructure and a lot of hesitation towards gray infrastructure. Community access is extremely important. In adapting different mitigation techniques, it's really important that community members have access to the waterfront, to nature, and especially for activities like fishing. And stakeholders have asked that we identify specific areas of flood risk that haven't been assessed yet. So this is just an example of beginning to analyze that. So what this graph is showing us is an output from those interviews. So these are the preferred mitigation techniques, and this was generated by the community that we interviewed. And what we can see here pretty clearly is that there's a lot of excitement about green infrastructure and wanting to learn more about it. The blue bar is files. That indicates how many individual interviewees mentioned or brought up the whatever variable is along the axis. And then the references is just how many times in total it was mentioned throughout the interview process. So anti-hardening sentiments were brought up by the most people, and pro-green infrastructure, like I said, had the most enthusiasm, where people talked about that a lot during interviews. So the broader impacts and implications of this work, one of our interviewees had this quote that I think summarizes what our goals were this summer really well, which is that our community needs to change because to be resilient, they cannot look the way that they do today. As we know, climate change is accelerating. These flood impacts are becoming more severe, and we have to be able to adapt in a way that is sustainable and equitable. Right now, there are historic funding opportunities like the Inflation Reduction Act, the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative, and at the same time, lake levels are nearing historic averages. So it's kind of this culmination of ideal scenarios where there's an influx of funding and good research opportunities at the same time. So we really need to leverage this moment to support community resilience. This also supports actionable resilience frameworks. So resilient or recommendations for resiliency that can actually be achieved because it was generated using community feedback. And this work actively bridges the gap between science and decision makers, which I mentioned early on in this presentation. And going forward, I think that kind of work needs to be centered. I'd like to thank my mentors, Mike Shriberg and Kat Cameron. So many people supported me throughout this process. This is definitely not a comprehensive list, but thank you for everyone and all of your support. And that's it.
Great job, Abigail, and we have time for questions.
Hi, Abigail. Really great presentation. I was wondering if you could define what a coastal manager was and provide some examples of that. Sure.
So especially in these smaller communities, coastal managers can be anyone from the city manager to the emergency response professional. The exact name is escaping me. But as part of the issue too is that there isn't a strong definition of who that is. So they can be different in these different communities. We interviewed people who were city managers, emergency response professionals. Yeah, it really can vary. But I think a general definition are just people who are making decisions about coastal management.
Yeah, this work is really interesting, and I love to see how you go further with it in your future too. But a question I was thinking is even in my own civil engineering classes, a big talk is that when there's work done to adapt to the new changes and whatnot in one city, sometimes it negatively impacts another city. So I was wondering, were there conversations between the coastal managers of different cities, and if so, what was the conversation like?
So I didn't facilitate discussions between different coastal managers, but that came up a lot, where decisions being made in one community and how those might impact the next community. especially with those hard infrastructure tactics. Something else that came up a lot were peers and how like just that erosion effect from peers. If one community has a lot of them, it really affects a neighboring one. So that's what that community of practice and collaboration is all about, giving those community decision makers the ability to work with each other and come up with collective collaborative plans to ensure that there's more uniform practices along the coast.
Hi, I had a question. That was a great presentation. But when you're talking about environmental justice communities, what requirements did you use to assess that a community can be classified as an environmental justice community?
Sure. So this area is just historically, it's known as an EJ community. They've faced a lot of historic disinvestment and environmental challenges like flooding. They just a couple of years ago had a lead poisoning event in their water. But using that EJ tool, this one. So this EPA just came out with a couple of years ago, and it's used really frequently, and it's been able to better define who is in an EJ community. This specific indicator, the socioeconomic indicator, it's a function of income, education, percentage person of color, issues like particulate matter in the atmosphere. It just compiles all of those data points and comes up with a rating. So that's how the EPA does that. But like I said, this community is just known to have been historically disinvested from and have faced a lot of environmental justice issues.
I was going to ask something similar, but I have a follow-up to that kind of. So how does coastal flooding exacerbate those other social and environmental justice issues in Berrien County?
So in a lot of ways, something that came up a lot, like I said, is this disinvestment. So this neighboring community, for example, St. Joe, is much more affluent, and they have the public works, for example, to do things like clean out their storm drains and keep up with maintenance. When disasters happen and people are displaced, they're able to find housing for them, and that hasn't been the case in Benton Harbor. A lot of these flooding events we found are a result of, or I shouldn't say we found, we're finding because we're still working on it now, but a result of really stormwater damage, and that's from this lack of funding in public works. And also when these events do happen and people are displaced, it can be really disastrous. They can't find places for people to live. A lot of these homes are never repaired, they're just abandoned, and that contributes to the community's economic standing when people are just forced out when their homes are lost. So yeah, those are a few ways.
Hi, I was wondering if you could explain more about the coupled bar graph that you showed earlier about instances of different topics of mitigation and the frequency that they were brought up in conversation. I was curious if you considered and or removed any biases of, like, I guess, quote unquote, like mitigation literacy. Perhaps, you know, the participants of the interviews only knew about certain options, so they didn't talk about other things, you know what I mean? And then also if there was any potential biases or considerations in making this information, that to know whether or not it was positive or negative like review, or if they just brought it up, and if that was considered in the rest of your paper. Thanks.
Yeah, that's a really great question. So for these particular interviews, we were working with individuals who are professionals in this field. So we knew that there was a level of expertise. So we weren't too concerned about people not necessarily being educated on the different mitigation tactics. And for the other paper too, that was kind of the same deal. At this point, we're dealing with more decision makers and experts within these communities, and not necessarily community members that don't have any kind of role in this realm in the first place. So I think because we were dealing with who we considered to be experts, we didn't consider people who might just be favoring something because they don't know, you know, what the alternatives are. But that's a really great point, maybe something we should think about.
Hi, I just had a quick question over
green infrastructure versus gray infrastructure. You probably definitely explained this already, but I just haven't heard those terms before. And I wanted to hear about what examples of what those were and why there seems to be stronger preferences towards green infrastructure versus gray.
Sure. So gray infrastructure, you could also think of it as like hard infrastructure. So those are things like revetments, which are you sometimes like piles of rocks along the shoreline or like in the water, or a seawall that's trying to physically, or like a levee that's trying to physically prevent water from coming into the community. Green infrastructure is a way to leverage natural systems to mitigate undesirable impacts. So in the case of flooding, they might be something like rain gardens or permeable surfaces to allow water to disperse and filter in a way that it doesn't just sit in the community. So a lot of like these big storms that you hear about that flood out huge cities, a lot of that is because it's just impermeable surfaces for miles. So like permeable pavement is a way to address that. Something that we heard a lot, and I think they kind of go hand in hand, is that green infrastructure often supports co-benefits. So what those are benefits that meet a number of needs. So for example, we heard about fishing a lot. And if you put up a seawall, for example, it might have negative impacts on the fish population. It might limit access to people being able to get close to the shoreline. If instead you do like a restored wetland, it might actually have the impact of maybe restoring or at least maintaining those natural populations and giving people increased access to nature. But it should be mentioned, this isn't necessarily like an anti-hard infrastructure approach. I don't want it to come off that way either. A lot of times I think reasonable solutions are kind of in the middle, especially because the Great Lakes are so dynamic. You have water levels that really come in far. So if you make a constructed wetland and then the waters go out, that also won't really work. So a lot of people were interested in just learning more about green infrastructure so that they could have a better idea of what their options are. So it's not, I mean, a lot of people were pretty anti-hard infrastructure, but I think that the point that I got from it more than anything was that people just wanted to learn more about green infrastructure and how to permit it. Yeah, thank you so much, everyone.